You think you know your family. You break bread with them. You celebrate their mediocre achievements. You pretend not to notice when they are the good silverware at Thanksgiving. You build a life, a fortune, a legacy, and you tell yourself it's all for them, for the future, for the bloodline. What a crock of shit. I learned the truth the day my doctor, a perpetually nervous man named Evans with the handshake of a damp fish, showed me the scans. The thing in my head, he said, was a ticking clock with no snooze button. Glioblastoma, a word that sounds like a malevolent alien planet, but feels like a death sentence written in ice gold ink. 6 months, maybe 8 if I was lucky, and subjected myself to treatments that would turn me into a hollowed out ghost of a man. I looked at the grey and white swirls on the lightbox, this abstract painting of my own mortality, and my first thought wasn't fear. It wasn't grief. It was, I have to know. The fortune was part of it, sure. It built my company from a two-man operation in a rented garage to a multinational beast that manufactured specialized microchips. I didn't just climb the ladder, I built the damn ladder, and then sold it for a profit. The money was substantial, life-changing, generational wealth kind of money. But the money was just the bait. The real question, the experiment I decided to conduct with the dwindling sand in my hourglass, was about character. Who were these people I'd shared Christmases with for 6 decades? Were they the loving, if slightly dysfunctional, family they presented? Or were they vultures, patiently circling, waiting for the last twitch of the dying lion, so they could descend and pick the carcass clean? I needed a test, a crucible, something so tempting, so inherently unfair, that it would strip away all pretense and reveal the rotten core beneath, if it existed. That's where the safe came in. It's a magnificent beast, a Hayworth 850, 6 feet tall, forged from ballistic-grade steel, with a lock mechanism that looks like it belongs on the door of a nuclear missile silo. I'd had it installed in the library of my old Victorian house years ago, mostly to hold important physical deeds and a few sentimental items that were too valuable to keep in a bank security box, my late wife Eleanor's jewelry. For one, the family knew about it, of course. It was impossible to miss. They'd make jokes about it. What's in there, Larry? The crown jewels? My son-in-law, Mark, would ask, his laughter always a little too forced, his eyes a little too keen. He'd just smile and say, something like that. The rumor about the will started, not entirely by accident, over a particularly dry pot roast at a Sunday dinner about 2 months after my diagnosis. He'd already decided on my course of action, but hadn't yet set the stage. The family was all there. My daughter, Cynthia, a woman who had inherited her mother's looks, but coated them in a permanent layer of suburban bitterness. Her husband, Mark, a walking, talking midlife crisis, whose various startups had been funded exclusively by my generosity, and my grandson, Jason, a 22-year-old who communicated primarily in grunts and viewed the world through the smudged screen of his smartphone. The conversation, as it always did, veered toward the future, their future. My money. Just think, with a proper investment strategy, the capital could be structured to provide 4 decades of growth, Mark was saying, soaring through his meat like it had personally offended him. He'd been taking online finance courses again. Cynthia sighed, a practiced, weary sound. We just want what's best, Dad, to make sure your legacy is handled correctly. The lawyers downtown, the ones who did the Peterson estate, they're simply marvelous, very discreet. I chewed slowly, letting the silence stretch. Jason scrolled through TikTok, the tinny sound of a pop song leaking from his phone. I looked at them, these parasites who shared my DNA, and felt a cold clarity settle over me. I dabbed my mouth with my napkin. It's all taken care of. Cynthia's head snapped up. The will. You finalized it. With who? Old man Henderson, I said, referring to the 90-year-old family lawyer who'd drawn up my first will 40 years ago. He knows my wishes. Mark leaned forward, his eyes glinting. And those wishes are. I gave him a flat, dismissive stare. They're my wishes, Mark. That's the point of a will. I let them stew for a minute. Then, as if struck by a casual afterthought, I said, Besides, the important copy isn't with Henderson. 3 pairs of eyes locked onto me. Even Jason looked up from his phone. What do you mean? Cynthia asked, her voice tight. Oh, Henderson has a copy. Sure, but the executed original, the one that's been notarized and witnessed, and is legally binding, that's in the safe. I gestured with my head toward the library. I like to keep the important things close. The air in the room changed. It became thick, charged with a greedy electricity. I had thrown a single, bloody nugget of meat into the shark tank. The safe, Mark said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But that thing is, how do you even get into it? I smiled, a thin, cryptic smile. It's a biometric lock, state of the art, only responds to 2 things. I held up a finger, my retina. I held up a second finger, or my fingerprint. Nothing else. No codes, no keys. If the power fails, it has a 12-hour internal battery backup. It's impregnable. I let that hang in the air, watching the calculations going on behind their eyes. A will, the real will, locked away in a vault that only I could open. That seems insecure, Cynthia said, trying to sound concerned rather than thwarted. What if something happens to you? Then I suppose you'll have to rely on the copy at Henderson's office, I said smoothly, returning to my pot roast. Unless, of course, you can get my body to the safe before and cold. The scanner is quite sensitive. I said it as a joke. A morbid, off-color joke. They all forced laughs, the sound brittle and unnatural. But I saw the look that passed between Cynthia and Mark. A look of pure, unadulterated possibility. The bait had been taken. The hook was set. Now, I just had to play the line. The next phase was the performance. I began a careful, meticulous campaign of decline. I cancelled a few social engagements, pleading fatigue. I let my hands develop a very slight, very deliberate tremor when I poured my evening whiskey. I started using a cane I didn't strictly need. Its solid tap-tap-tap on the hardwood floors a constant auditory reminder of my fragility. I'd have dizzy spells during their visits, needing to sit down suddenly, breathing heavily. It's the medication. I'd whisper hoarsely, waving a dismissive hand. Just a side effect. Doctor says it's perfectly normal. I was lying, of course. I'd refused all treatment. The only thing in my system was single malt scotch and a burning desire for the truth. But they bought it. Their visits became more frequent, their concern more cloying and transparent. They were watching the clock. They were waiting for me to topple over. I also made a show of being paranoid about the safe. I'd often check on it in front of them, placing my hand on the cold steel door, aligning my eye with the discreet retinal scanner hidden behind a panel, listening for the soft, satisfying chunk of the bolts retracting. I'd open it just a crack, just enough to show it was functional, that the treasure within was still secure, before closing it again with a heavy thud. Can't be too careful, I'd mutter, more to myself than to them. The final piece of the plan was the most audacious. I needed a witness, someone outside the family, someone unimpeachably honest. I called Henderson, my lawyer, the real Henderson, not the doddering old fool that described to my family. Frank Henderson is sharp as a tack and possesses a moral compass that points true north without a hint of deviation. I laid out my entire scheme for him. The cancer, the safe, the bait, my deeply suspicious family. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Larry, he said finally, his voice a dry rasp. This is Byzantine. Even for you. It's cruel. Is it? I countered. Or is it just due diligence? I need to know who I'm leaving my life's work to. Frank, I'll not have Eleanor's memory, or my company, turned over to a pack of hyenas. If they are, then they get nothing. Every last cent goes to the Eleanor Grace Foundation for underprivileged kids. If they pass the test well, then the original will stand. And the test is to see if they'll try to drag your unconscious body to a safe to steal a will that may or may not exist, he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. Precisely, I said. I'm creating a scenario of overwhelming temptation. I'm handing them the opportunity for a seemingly victimless crime. I'm not really being hurt, am I? It'll be unconscious. If they are the decent people they pretend to be, They'll call an ambulance. They'll be concerned for my health. If they are who I fear they are, they'll see an opportunity and take it. Another long pause. You're a cynical old bastard, Larry. The world made me this way. Frank, will you help me? He sighed, a sound of pure professional exasperation. What do you need? I need you to be here, hidden, in the house, on the day I decide to spring the trap. I need you to see and hear everything, as my lawyer and an impartial witness. Good God, where am I supposed to hide? In a wardrobe. The panic room, I said. Off the master bedroom. It has a video feed and audio from cameras I had installed in the library after Eleanor passed. I was paranoid about burglaries. Now I'm just paranoid about my own flesh and blood. You'll see and hear everything. You'll record it. For the inevitable legal challenges, Frank agreed. Though I suspect it was less out of friendship and more out of a macabre curiosity to see if I was right. The stage was set. The players were in place. Though they didn't know their roles, I just needed my cue to fall. It came on a cold, rainy Tuesday. They were all coming for dinner, Cynthia, Mark, and Jason. The perfect audience. I prepared the meal myself, a rich beef bourguignon, and I prepared my special ingredient, a powerful, fast-acting sedative prescribed to me for the insomnia I'd claimed the cancer medications caused. It crushed the tablets into a fine powder and kept it in a small envelope in my pocket. The evening was a masterpiece of farce. They were all on their best behavior, suffocating me with faux concern. Cynthia fussed over the salt content of the stew. Mark talked about the volatile stock markets and how important stable, hands-on management of any large estate was. Jason just ate, his phone conspicuously absent, his eyes constantly flicking toward the library door. During dessert, I made my move. In feeling a bit lightheaded, I announced, putting a hand to my forehead. The room is spinning. Must have stood up too fast. Dad, you should lie down, Cynthia said, her voice laced with a thrilling undercurrent of excitement. No, in fine. Just need a glass of water. I pushed myself up from the table, making a show of wobbling. I made my way to the kitchen, my back to them. With practiced speed, I poured a glass of water, palmed the envelope of powder, and dumped it in. It dissolved instantly. I gave it a quick stir with my finger. I walked back into the dining room, the glass in my trembling hand. I took a few small sips. There, that should I began. And then let my words slur. I let my eyes go unfocused. I put a hand on the table to steady myself. Whoa, that's a strong dizzy spell. I looked at them. Their faces were a blur, but I could see the expressions. Cynthia's was a mask of feigned alarm. Mark's was one of naked avarice. Jason's was just confused. Dad, Cynthia said, rising from her chair. I don't feel so good, I mumbled. And then I let go. I let my knees buckle. I collapsed to the Persian rug in a heap, making sure to knock over a water glass with a dramatic crash as I went down. The impact was jarring, but the thick rug absorbed most of it. I closed my eyes and went completely, utterly limp. I was now a prop, a key to the kingdom. The immediate reaction was panic, but it was the wrong kind of panic. Oh my God, Larry, Mark shouted. I heard chairs scraping back. Is he breathing? Cynthia's voice, sharp, close to my ear. A hand, Mark's, I think, fumbled at my throat for a pulse. My own heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat they had to be able to feel. I focused everything I had on keeping my breathing deep, slow, and even. The sedative would soon kick in for real, helping to sell the effect, slowing my metabolism. But for now, I was hyper-aware, every sense screaming. Hayes got a pulse, Mark said, his voice tight. It's thready, but it's there. We need to call an ambulance. That was Jason. A flicker of hope. Was the kid actually decent? Wait. Cynthia's voice, cold, decisive, cutting through the panic. Just wait. Silence. I could feel them standing over me. A triangle of greed surrounding my supposedly prone form. Wait for what, Mom? Grandpa's sick. Jason protested. Think, Jason, Mark said, his voice dropping to a hushed, urgent whisper. Think, if they take him to the hospital, he could be gone 4 days, in a coma. Anything could happen. So, Jason said, his voice cracking with confusion and genuine fear. The safe, you idiot, Cynthia hissed. This might be our only chance. My heart, already pounding, felt like it might explode out of my chest. There it was, the first tug on the line, the first confirmation that my darkest suspicions were valid. What? No, Jason said. We can't do that. That's messed up. It's practical, Mark snapped. Hayes out cold. He won't feel a thing. We get the will. We see what it says. If it's fair, fine. We call the ambulance. If it's not, well, we have time to discuss things with Henderson. You mean destroy it, Jason said, his voice hollow with disbelief. I mean secure the family's future. Cynthia corrected him, her voice like steel. Your future, Jason. Now, are you going to help us or not? One didn't hear Jason's response, but I didn't hear him leave to call for a help either. His silence was his answer. Complicity. The kid was weak, not moral. Another disappointment, but not a surprise. Okay, Mark said, his voice buzzing with adrenaline. Okay. How do we do this? The retinal scan? Or the fingerprint? The fingerprint reader is on the handle, Cynthia said. I could almost hear her mind working, planning. She'd been studying it. Of course she had. It's easier. We just need his hand. Hayes heavy, Mark grunted. Then stop complaining and lift, Cynthia commanded. Jason, get his feet. Hands grabbed me. Mark at my shoulders. Jason, after a moment's hesitation, at my ankles. They hoisted me off the ground. My head lolled back, my arms dangling. I was a sack of meat, a puppet on strings held by my own family. The indignity of it was a fire in my veins, but I remained limp, a dead weight. They carried me out of the dining room, through the hall, and into the book-lined sanctum of the library. I could sense the change in light through my closed eyelids, smell the familiar scent of old paper and leather. They dumped me unceremoniously on the floor in front of the safe. My shoulder connected with the hardwood with a painful thud. I barely suppressed a grunt. Okay, Mark panted. His hand. Get his hand. Cynthia knelt beside me. I could feel her breath on my face. She grabbed my right wrist, her grip surprisingly strong, and lifted my arm. My hand was manipulated, my fingers pressed against the cold, smooth surface of the biometric reader embedded in the safe's handle. A soft, electronic tone sounded. A red light glowed against my eyelids. Scan unsuccessful. Please try again. A synthetic female voice echoed in the quiet room. Damn it, Mark muttered. You have to flatten his fingers out. Hayes all curled up. In trying, Cynthia snapped. She pried at my fingers, forcing them straight. I had to consciously fight my body's instinct to resist. She pressed my palm firmly against the scanner again. Scan unsuccessful. Please try again. What's wrong with it? Jason whined. Maybe Hayes too, I don't know. Dead. Does it need a live pulse or something? Don't be morbid, Cynthia said. But her voice was tinged with uncertainty. Maybe it's the angle. Lift him up. Prop him up against the safe. They manhandled me again, hauling me into a sitting position, my back against the cold steel door. My head slumped forward onto my chest. The sedative was beginning to work its magic now. A heavy, woolly blanket starting to descend over my conscious mind. I fought it, clinging to awareness through sheer force of will. I had to see this through. I had to hear it all. Try again, Mark ordered. Cynthia grabbed my wrist again, lifted my hand, and pressed it to the reader. Scan unsuccessful. Please try again. God damn it. Mark exploded. It's not working. Maybe we need to try the eye scanner, Cynthia said, her voice desperate now. Jason, hold his head. Keep it steady. His eyes are closed, Jason said, his voice shaky. So open them. Mark barked. Hands on my face. Jason's, I think, fingers, clumsy and trembling, pried at my eyelids. I let them. I kept my eyes rolled back in my head, showing only the whites, the way an unconscious person's would. It took every ounce of my self-control to flinch, not to blink. I can't get it right, Jason stammered. He's not looking at it. We have to hold him up to it, Cynthia decided. Mark, You take his body. Jason, you hold his head. I'll operate the scanner panel. More grunting, more straining. They hauled my dead weight to my feet, my legs buckling beneath me. Mark held me from behind, his arms under my armpits, my head lolling back on his shoulder. Jason stood in front of me, his hands on either side of my face, holding my head steady, his fingers painfully pressing into my temples. I could smell his cheap cologne and the scent of his fear. Cynthia's hand reached out. I heard a soft click as she opened the disguised panel that hid the retinal scanner. A faint blue light now played against my closed lids. "Okay," she whispered, her voice tense with anticipation. Open his eye, wide. Jason's thumb rough. Jason's thumb was dry and rough against my eyelid. It was the hand of a kid who'd never done a day of real work, but spent too much time on a game controller. He pressed down, trying to pry my eye open. I fought the instinct to squeeze it shut, to rebel against this profound violation. I had to let it happen. I had to let them go all the way. For the experiment. For the truth. My eye was forced open. The world was a bleary, unfocused mess. The brilliant, icy blue beam of the retinal scanner lanced into my pupil, a needle of pure light. It was blinding, agonizing. I saw Jason's face, hovering inches from mine, his own eyes wide, with a terrifying mixture of horror and excitement. Behind him, I could make out the blurred shape of Cynthia, her finger poised over the scan button on the open panel. This was it, the point of no return. They were no longer just contemplating a crime, they were wrist-deep in the act, desecrating my unconscious body for a shot at my money. The last fragile thread of any hope I might have secretly harbored snapped. The love I'd once felt for my daughter curdled in my chest into something black and poisonous. The affection for my grandson evaporated, leaving only a cold, clinical disappointment. The scanner beeped, processing the data of my forcibly exposed retina, scanning the synthetic voice intoned. This was my cue, the moment of revelation. But a cold, calculating fury held me back for a fraction of a second longer. Let them think they've won. Let them taste the very edge of their victory. Let them believe the safe is about to open, and all their dreams are about to come true. Then, and only then, would I pull the rug out from under their wretched, greedy feet. The scanner beeped again. Scan complete. Identity confirmed. Welcome, Lawrence. A sound of pure, unadulterated triumph escaped Cynthia's lips. It was a half-gasp, half-moan of ecstasy. I heard the heavy, mechanical chunk of the primary bolts retracting deep within the steel door. The safe was opening. For them. Yes. Mark hissed from behind me, his grip on my armpits tightening. We're in. We're in. It was the perfect crescendo of their avarice, the absolute peak of their transgression. And that's when I decided to speak. I didn't shout. I didn't roar. My voice came out as a dry, rasping thing, quiet, but impossibly clear in the tense silence of the library. It was the voice of a man who was very much awake, and very, very angry. Having fun? I asked. The effect was instantaneous and glorious. Jason recoiled as if he'd vomited acid into his face. He let out a strangled yelp and stumbled backward, tripping over the leg of an armchair, and crushing to the floor a heap of limbs and pure terror. His hands, the ones that had just been holding my head steady for the larceny, flew to his mouth. Mark's arms, which had been holding my dead weight, instantly turned to limp noodles. He didn't just let go, he shoved me away from him in a spasm of revulsion and shock. I let myself fall forward, catching myself on my hands and knees on the Persian rug. I stayed there for a moment, head hanging down, drawing in a deep, ragged breath. The sedative was still a fuzzy blanket in my mind, but the adrenaline was burning through it fast. I lifted my head and looked at my daughter. Cynthia was frozen. Her finger was still extended toward the scanner panel. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her expertly applied makeup standing out in grotesque, clown-like patches. Her jaw was slack, her eyes wide with a kind of primal, animal disbelief. She wasn't processing it. Her brain had simply short-circuited. The safe door was open a mere 2 inches, a sliver of darkness promising a fortune. How new? On some fundamental level, she would never touch. Dad. The word was a tiny, broken thing, a squeak of a mouse caught in a trap. Don't, I said, pushing myself slowly, deliberately, to my feet. I brushed the dust from the knees of my trousers. My body ached from the manhandling. My shoulder throbbed from where they dropped me, and my eye burned from the scanner's assault. But I'd never felt more powerful in my entire life. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders, letting the facade of the frail, dying old man fall away completely. I was Lawrence fucking Grady again. The man who built an empire. The man they had profoundly underestimated. Don't you dare dad me, I said, my voice low and venomous. You lost the right to call me that about 30 seconds ago, when you decided my unconscious body was your personal keychain. It's not what it looks like, Mark blurted out, finding his voice. It was shrill, panicked. You collapsed. We were trying to help. I turned my gaze to him. He looked pathetic, his face pale and sweaty. His designer shirt rumpled from the effort of hauling my carcass around. Help, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Is that what you call it, Mark? Dragging me across the house to rob me. What was the next step in this helping process? If the will was to your liking, you'd call an ambulance. And if it wasn't, what? Would you have helped me along to my grave a little faster? A pillow over the face. An accidental overdose. The color that had left Cynthia's face now flooded back into it in an ugly, crimson blush of rage and shame. How dare you? She shrieked, finding her footing in familiar, hysterical territory. How dare you accuse us of such a thing? You were sick. We were scared. We thought if we could see the will, we could understand your final wishes. To honor you. I actually laughed. It was a harsh, bark-like sound with no humor in it whatsoever. You are a spectacular liar, Cynthia. You always have been. Do you remember when you were 8? And you stole $20 from your mother's purse to buy that ridiculous doll? You looked me right in the eye and blamed it on the cleaning lady. You have the same look on your face now. All righteous indignation, covering a core of pure, rotten deceit. I took a step toward the safe. They all flinched. I reached out and placed my hand on the cool steel of the door. You wanted to see what was inside so badly. You went to all this trouble. Let's have a look, shall we? I pulled the heavy door open. It swung outward on its perfectly balanced hinges, silent and smooth. The inside was not what they expected. There were no stacks of bearer bonds, no velvet bags bulging with jewels, no leather-bound last will and testament. The safe was empty except for 3 items. On the top shelf sat a small, worn, plush elephant. It was missing one button eye, and its grey fur was matted with age. It was Ellabelle, the toy he'd given Cynthia on her first birthday. She'd slept with it every night until she left for college. On the middle shelf was a framed photograph. It was of me and Eleanor on our honeymoon in Greece. We were young, tanned, laughing, our arms wrapped around each other. The Aegean Sea a brilliant blue behind us. We looked incandescently happy. We were looking at the camera, but we only had eyes for each other. And on the bottom shelf, centered with meticulous care, was a single, old-fashioned micro-cassette recorder, the kind from the 80s. Its record light was a bright, accusing red eye glowing in the dim interior of the safe. I reached in and picked up the recorder. I held it up for them to see. Their faces were a study in bewildered confusion. The treasure chest was a time capsule of sentimentality. It made no sense to their avaricious minds. What is this? Cynthia whispered, her eyes darting from the ragged elephant to the photograph to the recorder. This, I said, my thumb hovering over the stop button on the recorder, is the only thing of true value that was ever in this safe. The rest of it, the money, the deeds, the stocks, they're in a vault in Zurich. This I pressed the button. The red light went out. This was my insurance policy. I turned and looked toward the library door. Frank, I believe we have all the evidence we need. You can come out now. The panic that had been on their faces before was nothing compared to the sheer, unadulterated terror that gripped them now. Their heads swiveled as one toured the doorway. Frank Henderson stepped into the library. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face a grim, implacable mask of professional disdain. In one hand, He held a sleek tablet computer. In the other, a small, professional-grade digital recorder. Its own red light also glowing. Had been listening. Had been recording. Had seen everything. "Hello, Cynthia." "Mark," Frank said, his voice as dry and cold as a tomb. "Jason." He gave the boy a brief, pitying glance. Jason, who was still on the floor, looked like he wanted to sink through the rug and disappear. "Mr. Henderson," Mark stammered. This is a misunderstanding." "Oh, I think it's been understood perfectly," Frank said, holding up the tablet. On its screen, frozen in high-definition clarity, was a video image. It was a wide shot of the library, taken from a camera high in the corner of the room. It showed all of them, clear as day, manhandling my limp body. He tapped the screen, and the video played, silent but damning. We all watched as they dragged me, as Cynthia forced my hand to the scanner, as Jason pried my eye open. Frank stopped the video. "The audio is particularly incriminating. The part where you discuss the possibility of my client being dead for the scanner is a standout." Cynthia made a sound like a wounded animal. She took a step back, shaking her head. "You set us up." She whirled on me, her finger pointing, her whole body trembling with a rage so pure it was almost impressive. "You sick, twisted old man. You faked it. All of it. The cancer, the weakness, it was all a lie." "The cancer is real," I said calmly. "The doctor's reports are in the top drawer of my desk, if you'd care to verify. My impending death is the one thing in this entire sordid affair that isn't a performance. The weakness, however, that was for your benefit. A test, one you failed in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. A test," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You tested us. Who does that? A man who wants to know the character of the people who will inherit his life's work," I replied. "And now I know. You're not just greedy. You're monsters. The lot of you. We're your family." Mark yelled, finding a shred of courage in his desperation. "You are blood," I corrected him, my voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "You stopped being my family the moment you saw me lying on that floor and saw opportunity instead of a person. Family doesn't do this." I walked over to my favorite armchair, the one by the fireplace where I'd spent countless evenings reading with Eleanor, and sat down. I was tired. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the deep, profound exhaustion of a man who has just confirmed his worst fears about the world. I looked at the three of them, standing there like guilty schoolchildren, their world collapsing around them. "Frank," I said, without looking at him, "the documents, if you please." Frank opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers. He laid them on the small reading table next to my chair. "What is that?" Cynthia asked, her voice hollow. "This," I said, patting the papers, "is the new last will and testament of Lawrence Grady, executed and witnessed by Mr. Henderson here, just yesterday. It revokes all previous wills and codicils." I looked up at her, meeting her horrified gaze. "In it, I leave the sum of $1 to each of you, a token, so you cannot contest the will on grounds of being accidentally overlooked." Jason finally found his voice from the floor. $1, he whispered, as if it were the most unbelievable part of this whole nightmare. "The rest of my estate," I continued, as if he hadn't spoken, "including my controlling shares in the company, my properties, and all liquid assets, will be placed in a trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust will be the Eleanor Grace Foundation. You remember it, Cynthia, the charity your mother founded to help children whose parents have, well, failed them." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. It was the sound of generational wealth evaporating into thin air. "You can't do this," Mark said, but the fight had gone out of him. It was a weak, automatic protest. "I can, and I have," I said. "And thanks to your little performance tonight, which Frank and I have recorded on no less than 3 separate devices, any contestation of this will be laughed out of probate court. You tried to loot the body of your dying father and grandfather before it was even cold. No judge on earth will look kindly on that." I picked up the micro cassette recorder from the safe. "And this is just for me." A little message I recorded for myself a few weeks ago, when I first devised this plan. A reminder of why I was doing it. A reminder of what I was really protecting. I didn't play it for them. It was none of their business. On the tape, my voice, thick with emotion, talked about Eleanor, about the love we shared, about the promise it made to her to always protect what we'd built from vultures, and about my heartbreak at realizing the vultures were our own offspring. Cynthia finally broke. The anger vanished, replaced by a raw, desperate pleading. She fell to her knees on the rug before me. The same rug they'd dumped me on. "Dad, please," she sobbed, real tears now cutting through her makeup. "Please, we're sorry. We weren't thinking. We were scared. We made a terrible, terrible mistake. Please don't do this. Don't cut us out. I'm your daughter, your only child." I looked down at her. I saw the little girl who had once run to me with skinned knees, who I had pushed on a swing for hours, who I had walked down the aisle. I saw all those ghosts, and then I saw the woman who had just ordered her son to hold my eye open while she tried to steal from me. The ghosts weren't enough anymore. They couldn't protect her. "Get up, Cynthia," I said, my voice devoid of all warmth. "You're embarrassing yourself." She stared at me, her mouth agape, the plea dying on her lips. She saw it then. She saw the absolute, unchangeable finality in my eyes. There was no forgiveness here, no second chances. The experiment was over, and the results were conclusive. She slowly, shakily, got to her feet. The tears stopped. The mask of the grieving, wronged daughter slipped away, and what was left underneath was something barren and hateful. She looked at me with a pure, undiluted venom I had never seen in another human being's eyes. "You are a hateful, miserable old man," she spat, her voice trembling with malice. "You wanted this. You wanted to prove you were always better than us. You wanted to humiliate us. You'll die alone in this big, empty house, and no one will mourn you. I hope it's painful. I hope you suffer." I simply nodded. "I already have, Cynthia. 4 years. Watching you become this. Goodbye." She turned without another word and walked out of the library. She didn't look back. Mark hesitated for a second, his eyes darting between me and the doorway. Then he scurried after her like a whipped dog. Jason was the last. He finally climbed to his feet, his face pale and streaked with tears of shame. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Jason," I said. He flinched. "I'm sorry, Grandpa." He mumbled to the floor. I didn't want to, but you did," I said. Not unkindly, but with a firm, undeniable truth. "You had a choice. When your mother told you to get my feet, you could have said no. You could have run to the phone and called for help. You could have been a decent human being, but you chose them. You chose the path of least resistance. Remember this feeling. Remember the cost of that choice. Now get out of my house." He fled. I heard the front door slam shut a moment later, the sound echoing through the silent, empty halls. I let out a long, slow breath I felt like he'd been holding for a decade. The weight of the performance, the tension of the confrontation, the crushing weight of my confirmed suspicions, it all settled on me at once. I felt every one of my 78 years. I felt the tumor in my head, a malevolent presence reminding me that this victory, however satisfying, was ultimately temporary. Frank Henderson quietly closed the safe door. The heavy thud was the period at the end of the sentence. He walked over and placed the tablet and the digital recorder on the table next to the new will. "It's all there, Larry," he said quietly. "Video and audio from 3 angles. It's irrefutable." "I know," I said, rubbing my temples. "Thank you, Frank, for being here. It was an education," he said, his tone unreadable. He looked around the library, at the scene of the crime. "What will you do now?" I looked at the photograph of Eleanor in the safe. It left the door ajar. I wanted to see her face. "Now," I said, a profound weariness seeping into my bones. "Now I wait. The cancer will do its job, but it won't find me a dupe. It won't find me a victim. It'll find me a man who finally knows the truth. A man who has settled his accounts." Frank nodded, understanding that his presence was no longer required. "He'll file the will first thing in the morning. I'll also secure copies of the evidence in my firm's vault. Call me if you need anything. I will, I said. But we both knew I wouldn't. He let himself out. I listened to his footsteps fade away, then the open and close of the front door, and then there was only silence. I was alone. Truly, utterly alone. I had wanted the truth, and I had gotten it. I had orchestrated this entire elaborate scheme, and I had won. I had exposed the rot, and I had protected Eleanor's legacy. I should have felt triumphant, victorious, but sitting there in the quiet library, the only thing I felt was a hollow, aching emptiness, the kind of emptiness that not even billions of dollars could fill. I had proven my point, and in doing so, I had incinerated the last remnants of my family. I was now the king of a barren castle, the ruler of a kingdom of one. I reached out and picked up the worn, threadbare elephant from the safe. I held it in my hands, this relic of a simpler time, when my little girl believed I could fix anything, and the worst thing in the world was a lost toy. A single, hot tear escaped my eye and traced a path down my cheek. It wasn't for them. It wasn't even for me. It was for the memory of the people we all used to be, before the money, before the resentment, before the greed, for the family that existed only in photographs and in the faded fur of a child's forgotten toy. I had caught them in the act. One had been emphatically, conclusively right, and it felt like the most crushing defeat of my life. The silence in the house was no longer just an absence of sound, it was a presence, a heavy, woolen blanket smothering everything. I sat in my armchair for a long time, just staring at the empty fireplace, the plush elephant held loosely in my hand. The adrenaline had fully receded, leaving me shivering slightly despite the warm room. The chemical fear and anger they had injected into the air was dissipating, but the psychic residue of their betrayal felt like a stain on the Persian rug, on the leather books, on me. I had prepared for this moment for weeks. I had envisioned it 1,000 times. In my mind's eye, I had always seen myself in this chair, a glass of expensive scotch in my hand, a grim smile of satisfaction on my face as I listened to the sound of their fleeing cars. I would be the vindicated patriarch, the clever old fox who had outsmarted the greedy pups. The reality was a hollowed out ache in the center of my chest. Frank's words echoed in the silence. It was an education. An education in what? The depths of human venality. I was already a PhD in that subject. This was just the final, brutal, postgraduate thesis defense, and I had passed with flying colors, my honor intact, my legacy secured. My soul felt like it had been scoured with sandpaper. I thought about Cynthia's final words. "You'll die alone, I hope you suffer." She was right about the first part. The second part was redundant. The knowledge that my own child could look at me with such naked hatred was a suffering had not adequately prepared for. I had expected greed. I had expected cowardice. I had not prepared for the sheer, annihilating hate. It was a vortex, and staring into it had taken a piece of me with it. With a grunt of effort, I pushed myself out of the chair. My body protested every movement. The physical toll of the sedative and the manhandling was setting in. One felt 100 years old. I walked slowly to the sidebar and poured 3 fingers of a Macallan 25 that cost more than Mark's first car. I didn't sip it. I threw it back, the amber liquid burning a welcome path of fire down my throat. A concrete sensation to ground me in a reality that felt suddenly, terribly fragile. I needed to move. I couldn't just sit in the silence with my thoughts. They were getting too loud. I picked up the micro cassette recorder from the table. My thumb stroked the plastic casing. I hadn't lied to them, it was a message for myself. A reminder. But I needed to hear it now. I needed to hear the voice of the man I was before this night. The man who still had a shred of hope, however faint, that he might be wrong. I pressed play. There was a hiss of tape, then a clearing of a throat. My voice, older, wearier, but still recognizably mine, filled the library. "Larry, if you're listening to this, then it's done. The plan worked. They took the bait." A long pause, a sigh that was full of a world of pain. "And I am so sorry that it did. A part of me, a stupid, sentimental part I thought had beaten out of myself decades ago, hoped I was wrong. I hoped that when I fell, Cynthia would scream for an ambulance. I hoped Mark would show a shred of decency. I hoped Jason would be the one voice of reason. I hoped the love we're supposed to have for each other would be stronger than the money. I heard the crack in my recorded voice. I heard the tears he was fighting back. The me of a few weeks ago was still capable of tears. But it wasn't. And now you know. And now you're alone. And it's going to hurt. It's going to feel like you've lost everything, even though you've technically won. Don't try to drink the hurt away. Don't try to ignore it. Sit with it. Feel it. You earned this pain. Same as you earned the money. It's the price of the truth. Another pause. The sound of a glass being set down. Remember why you're doing this. Remember Eleanor. Remember the look in her eyes when she talked about the foundation, about helping those kids who got a raw deal from life. She would have been horrified by what happened here tonight, but she would have been proud of you for protecting her dream from us, from our rotten bloodline. You're not leaving it to strangers, Larry. You're leaving it to her. It was always hers. You were just building it for her. I had to stop the tape. I couldn't bear it. The voice was too raw, too full of a grief that was now my constant companion. He was right. The pain was here. It was a physical weight on my sternum, making it hard to breathe. I looked at the photograph in the safe. Eleanor's smiling, youthful face, forever frozen in a moment of perfect joy. I did it, Ellie, I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded alien, broken. I kept them from picking your bones clean. I kept it safe. The only answer was the relentless, accusing silence. I ejected the micro cassette from the recorder. I walked to the fireplace. Though there was no fire, I took a silver cigarette lighter from the mantelpiece, a gift from Eleanor, engraved with my initials, a habit he'd given up for her decades ago, but had never gotten rid of the accoutrement. I flicked it open, my thumb rasping against the wheel. A small, steady flame bloomed. I held the tiny plastic cassette over the flame. The tape inside curled, blackened, and melted. A wisp of acrid, toxic smoke rose into the air. I held it until it began to soften and distort in my fingers. Then I dropped the melted ruin into the cold grate. I didn't need the recording anymore. The message was etched into my soul now, branded there by the fire of tonight's events. The act felt final. It felt like a cremation. I was burning the last of my own sentimentality. The man on that tape was gone. The father who cherished memories of a little girl and a stuffed elephant was gone. All that was left was Lawrence Grady, the executor of his own estate, the warden of his own solitude. I turned away from the fireplace. The house felt immense, a cavern of memories that had all just turned sour. Every object, every piece of furniture, held a history that now seemed like a lie. The chair Cynthia had curled up in to read, the table where Jason had done his homework. They were just things now, stage props from a play that had ended in tragedy. I walked through the ground floor, turning off lights, the dining room, where the remains of our last supper sat congealing on the plates. The stew looked like a crime scene. I didn't bother cleaning it up. One didn't have the energy. Let it rot. I climbed the stairs, my hand gripping the banister tightly. Each step was an effort. The sedative was still pulling at me, but my mind was racing, replaying every second, every word, every look of greed and hatred on their faces. It was a hell of my own making, and I was its sole inhabitant. I bypassed my bedroom. I couldn't face the big, empty bed he'd shared with Eleanor. Instead, I went to the one room in the house that felt like a true sanctuary now, the panic room. It was hidden behind a false wall in my walk-in closet. I pressed a sequence of buttons on a disguised keypad, and a section of the wall slid open with a soft hydraulic hiss. Inside was a small, Spartan space, a reinforced steel door, a bank of monitors now gone dark, a simple cot, a shelf with bottled water and emergency rations, and a single, hard-backed chair. Frank had been sitting in that chair 4 hours. I could still smell a faint hint of his cologne in the enclosed space. I sat down in the chair he'd vacated and looked at the bank of blank screens. On one of them, I could see the faint reflection of my own face, pale, drawn, eyes shadowed with exhaustion and pain. I had watched them from in here. I'd seen the whole thing play out on these monitors in cold, Clinical high definition. It heard their plotting through the speakers. I had been the omnipotent, unseeing God of this little universe, judging them from my hidden throne. And now the show was over. The audience had gone home, and the God was left alone in the empty theater. I reached out and tapped a button on the console. The monitor for the library camera flickered to life. The view was from high in the corner, showing the empty armchair, the open safe door, the abandoned dinner table visible through the doorway. It was a silent, still life of aftermath. It looked like the set of a play after the actors had left the stage. I had what I wanted: proof, closure, victory. So why did it feel like I was the one who had lost everything? The thought arrived with the quiet certainty of a death knell. I had been so focused on testing them, on proving they were monsters, that I had never considered what it would mean if I was right. I had weaponized my own death, turned my final days into a sting operation against my own family. I had chosen truth over love, and now I was left with nothing but the cold, hard, sterile truth. And the truth was, I was dying, and I was alone. The enormity of it finally crashed down on me, there in that sterile, claustrophobic little room. It wasn't a sob, it was something deeper, more primitive. A dry, heaving shudder that racked my entire frame. I doubled over in the chair, my arms wrapped around my stomach, as wave after wave of absolute, desolate loneliness broke over me. There were no tears this time. I was too empty for tears. This was the grief of a man who had just attended his own funeral and found nobody else there. I don't know how long I sat like that. Time had lost all meaning. The only thing that existed was the pain and the low, electric hum of the panic room's life support systems. Eventually, the storm passed. The shuddering subsided. I uncurled myself, feeling spent, scraped clean. I felt a strange sense of calm descend. The calm after the catastrophe. There was nothing left to fear. The worst had already happened. I had looked into the abyss of my family's soul, and the abyss had looked back and grinned. There were no more surprises, no more tests. There was only the waiting. I stood up, my joints cracking. I left the panic room, the door hissing shut behind me, sealing away that particular horror show. I walked back into my bedroom and over to the bedside table. I opened the drawer and took out the bottle of painkillers Drive Evans had prescribed for the discomfort of my final days. I hadn't taken a single one. I hadn't wanted anything to fog my mind, to impair my performance. Now, I shook two into my palm. I didn't bother with water. I dry swallowed them, the chalky bitterness of familiar penance. They wouldn't stop the real pain, but they might take the edge off the physical aches, might grant me a few hours of dreamless sleep. I lay down on top of the covers, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. The house settled around me, its old timbers groaning. I listened to the sounds of my life, the sounds of my prison. I had wanted to know, and now I did. The knowledge was a poison, and it was the only thing I had left. The rest of the night passed in a fitful, drug-haunted haze. I didn't so much sleep as lose consciousness, dragged under by the sedative and the painkillers. My dreams were fragmented, chaotic things, images of Cynthia as a little girl, a hand in mine, that melted into her face, twisted with hate, screaming at me. I saw the blue light of the retinal scanner, but it was a searchlight, hunting for me. I saw Eleanor, but she was always turning away, her back to me, walking into a bright light I couldn't follow her into. I woke up with a start, my heart hammering, the early morning sun slicing through a gap in the curtains. For a blissful second, I was disoriented. It was just another morning. Then the memory of the previous night crashed down on me, with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a nightmare, it was real. The hollow ache in my chest was still there. The silence of the house was still there. The truth was still there. I pushed myself up, my body protesting vehemently. I felt ancient. I shuffled into the ensuite bathroom and caught sight of myself in the mirror. I looked like hell. My face was pale and sagging. My eyes were bloodshot and surrounded by dark circles. The left one, the one Jason had pried open, was slightly red and puffy. I looked like a man who had gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight boxer and lost badly. I splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it helping to clear the last cobwebs of the drugs and the bad dreams. I avoided my own gaze in the mirror. I didn't want to see the man looking back at me, the architect of his own isolation. The house felt different in the daylight. The night time had given the events a theatrical, almost unreal quality. The morning sun was merciless. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the slight mess in the hallway from their rushed exit. It made everything seem ordinary, which somehow made it worse. The monstrous had occurred right here, in the bland light of day. My first instinct was to clean, to erase the physical evidence of their presence. I went downstairs, found a trash bag, and mechanically cleared the dining room table. I scraped the ruined beef bourguignon into the bag, the smell of it turning my stomach. I loaded the plates and glasses into the dishwasher. I wiped down the table. I was trying to scrub the memory away along with the gravy stains. It was futile, but the mindless physical labor was a welcome distraction. I saved the library for last. I stood in the doorway for a long time, just looking. The room was exactly as we'd left it. The armchair was slightly askew. The safe door was still open a couple of inches. The Persian rug was rumpled from where they'd dropped me, from where Cynthia had knelt to beg. This was the epicenter. This was where it had all happened. I walked in, my footsteps sounding too loud in the quiet. I righted the armchair. I walked to the safe. I placed my hand on the cold steel. I could still feel the ghost of their desperation clinging to it. I pulled the door open the rest of the way. Elabelle the elephant lay on her side. I picked her up. I looked at the photograph of me and Eleanor. Our smiling, youthful faces were a cruel joke now. We had no idea what the future held. The happiness in that photo felt like it belonged to two other people, people I barely remembered. I gently laid the elephant back on the shelf and straightened the photograph. I closed the safe door. The heavy bolts shot home with a final, definitive thunk. I didn't need to lock away those memories anymore. The people they represented were gone. My cleaning done, the house was spotless, sterile. It looked like a museum, or a show home, devoid of life, devoid of history. I had successfully erased all traces of the last night's drama, but I couldn't erase the feeling of it. It was in the air. It was in the walls. I made a pot of coffee, the ritual familiar and comforting. I took my mug and walked to the large bay window in the living room that looked out over the long, manicured driveway. The day was clear and bright. The world was going on as if nothing had happened. And then I saw it. A car. A familiar, sleek, black BMW. Mark's car. It was parked just outside the gates, at the end of my driveway. And standing beside it, leaning against the driver's side door, was Mark himself. He was just standing there, staring up at the house. He was too far away from me to make out his expression, but his posture was all wrong. It wasn't the slouch of defeat from last night. It was something else, something watchful, something patient. My blood ran cold. What was he doing here? Why hadn't he left? Had he been there all night? A jolt of something, not fear, not yet, but a sharp, alert apprehension shot through me. The game wasn't over. I had assumed the final whistle had blown, but one of the players was still on the field, and he was just standing there, waiting. For what? The coffee turned to acid in my stomach. What is he doing? This wasn't part of the script. The script ended with them fleeing in shame and terror, their inheritance vaporized, their characters exposed. They were supposed to lick their wounds, consult some ambulance-chasing lawyer who would tell them they were utterly screwed, and then spend the rest of their lives stewing in their own bitter resentment. They were not supposed to come back, not so soon, and certainly not to just stand there. I remained perfectly still behind the window, hoping the reflection on the glass would conceal me. Mark didn't move. He was just a silhouette against the bright morning, a statue of waiting. He lifted a hand, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he was waving at me, that had seen me. But he just rubbed his forehead, a gesture of fatigue or frustration. Had been there a while. A cold knot of dread began to form, tightening in my gut. This wasn't a plea for forgiveness. This wasn't a desperate attempt to reason with me. Those things would involve coming to the door, ringing the bell, perhaps even getting on their knees again. This was different. This was surveillance. This was a siege, My mind, still fuzzy from the drugs and the emotional cataclysm, began to grind back into motion, kicking into the old, familiar gear of strategy and threat assessment. Why would he be watching the house? The answer came immediately, and it was so obvious I cursed myself for not thinking of it sooner. They think him going to die soon. The performance of weakness, the doctor's terminal prognosis, they'd bought all of it. Last night, they'd been caught, exposed, and legally neutered. But their greed wasn't rational. It was a primal, desperate hunger. And a hungry animal, even when beaten back, will circle the carcass. They knew the new will was ironclad. They knew Frank Henderson had the evidence. But if I were to die before Frank could file the new will with the probate court, if some tragic, sudden accident were to befall me, then the previous will, the one old man Henderson was supposed to have, might suddenly reappear. The one that left everything to them. A will contest would be messy, but with me dead and unable to testify, with them claiming I was confused, manipulated by Frank in my final, adult days, it was a long shot. But for a fortune this large, long shots are worth taking. Mark wasn't just waiting. He was standing guard. He was making sure I didn't leave. He was the lookout, which meant Cynthia wasn't far away. And they weren't just planning to wait for the cancer to take me. Beaten animals don't wait patiently for their meal. They make it happen. The cold knot in my stomach turned to ice. The game wasn't over. It had just entered a new, far more dangerous phase. Last night had been about greed. This was about survival. Theirs. They had nothing left to lose. I'd taken everything from them. Now, the only way they could get it back was to take the only thing I had left, my life. A strange calm descended over me. The self-pity, the hollow ache, the existential grief, it all vanished, burned away by the sudden, clarifying fire of a direct threat. I wasn't Lawrence Grady, the sad, lonely old man anymore. I was Lawrence Grady, the fighter, the survivor, the man who had outmaneuvered rivals, hostile takeovers, and corporate spies for 5 decades. They had just made a catastrophic error. They had assumed the old lion was already dead. They were about to find out he still had very sharp teeth. I backed away from the window, keeping out of sight. My mind was racing, formulating a plan. First, I needed intelligence. I needed to know what I was dealing with. I went back upstairs to the panic room. The bank of monitors could access the external security cameras. I brought the system online. The screens flickered to life, showing various angles of the property perimeter. There was Mark's car, parked just beyond the closed electronic gate. I zoomed in. He was on his phone now, talking animatedly, gesturing with his free hand, arguing with Cynthia, no doubt. I panned the other cameras. The back of the property was clear, just a sprawling lawn sloping down to the woods. The other side gate was clear. They were only watching the front. Amateurs. They thought I was a feeble old man who could only use the front door. But then another camera, the one at the very end of the long driveway, caught a glimpse of a second vehicle, a dark blue SUV, recognized as Cynthia's, parked discreetly down the side road, mostly hidden by overgrown hedges. So there were 2 of them. Probably Jason was with his mother. They had the exits covered. My heart hammered against my ribs, but it was a clean, adrenaline-fueled beat now. Fear, but focused. I had the high ground. I had the fortifications. And I had something they desperately wanted, time. They had to make a move before Frank filed the will. I just had to hold out. I went to my bedroom closet, to the back, behind a panel of old suits I never wore. There, bolted to the wall, was a gun safe, another relic from a more paranoid time. After a rash of home invasions in the area had spooked Eleanor, I hadn't opened it in years. I dialed the combination Eleanor's birthday and swung the heavy door open. Inside, nestled in foam, was a Smith & Wesson .38 Chief Special, a snub nose, a weapon for close waters, for protection. I picked it up. The weight of it was cold and sobering in my hand. I checked the cylinder. It was loaded. I found a box of ammunition and a simple hip holster. I strapped it on, the leather feeling alien against my side. I hoped I wouldn't need it. The thought of pointing a gun at my own daughter, my own grandson, made me feel physically ill. but the thought of letting them murder me in my own home made me feel even worse. A weapon was only part of it. I needed to secure the house. I moved through the rooms, engaging the high security locks on all the doors and windows. The house became a fortress, each solid thunk of a deadbolt, sliding home another layer of defense. I disconnected the doorbell. I let the phone go to the answering machine. I was going dark. My next call was to Frank Henderson. I used the landline in the library, the one with a secure line. "Henderson," he answered on the first ring, his voice all business. "Frank, it's Larry." "Larry." I was just about to head to the courthouse. "Is everything?" He trailed off, sensing the tension in my silence. "They're here," I said, my voice low. "Mark's car is parked outside my gate. Cynthia's is down the road. They're watching the house." Frank was silent for a beat. When he spoke again, his voice was grim. "They're not there to apologize. No, they're not. I think they're waiting for an opportunity. I think they've decided the only way to undo last night is to make sure I don't live to see today through." "Good God, Larry," he breathed. "You need to call the police. Right now." "And say what?" I asked, a bitter smile touching my lips. "That my family, whom I just disinherited after tricking them into attempting to loot my safe, are now sitting in their cars outside. It sounds like a bad soap opera. They haven't done anything illegal yet. They're just parked. The police would come, have a word, and leave, and it would tell my children exactly what I know. It would force their hand. Right now, I have the advantage. They think I'm unaware. What are you going to do?" Frank asked, his concern palpable. "I'm going to wait," I said, looking out the window. Mark had gotten back in his car, but it hadn't moved. "I'm locked in. I'm secure. You file that will, Frank. You get it into the court system. That's the most important thing. That makes their potential actions pointless. That's my victory condition." "Larry, this is insane. You're talking about a siege. You're not a young man. What if they try to force their way in?" I touched the grip of the .38 at my side. "Then they'll find out I'm as helpless as I look." "I'm calling the police," Frank said, his lawyerly discretion finally overridden by genuine alarm. "No," I said, my voice firm. "Not yet. Filing the will is your job. Staying alive is mine. Do your job, Frank. Let me do mine." I hung up before he could argue. I knew he was right, on some level, but involving the police felt like ceding control. This was between me and them. It had to end where it started. The day stretched on, an excruciating exercise in tense waiting. I moved from window to window, camera monitor to camera monitor, keeping track of their positions. They never left. They took shifts. Mark would sit for a few hours, then drive off, and a few minutes later, Cynthia's SUV would take his place at the end of the driveway. They were coordinated. They were committed. As afternoon faded into evening, the nature of their presence changed. They became bolder. Mark got out of his car and walked right up to the gate, peering through the bars, trying to get a look at the house. Later, Cynthia did the same. They were testing, seeing if I would react, seeing if I was even watching. I stayed in the shadows. I didn't turn on any lights as dusk fell. I let the house go dark. I wanted them to wonder. I wanted them to get nervous. I ate a cold meal from the fridge standing up in the kitchen, my eyes glued to the small monitor it brought down from the panic room. The waiting was a psychological war. Who would break first? Them, sitting in their cars, their greed and fear curdling into desperation, or me, alone in the echoing silence of my mausoleum, waiting for the attack I knew was coming. It was fully dark when the first real move came. I was in the library, watching the camera feed, when I saw the headlights. Cynthia's SUV pulled up right behind Mark's car at the gate. Both car doors opened. Mark, Cynthia, and Jason got out. They stood together in the pool of light from the headlights, conferring. Jason was hunched, hands in his pockets, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Cynthia was doing most of the talking, gesturing sharply toward the house. Mark was nodding. This was it. The Council of War. The decision had been made. My mouth went dry. I checked the .38, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. This was no longer a theoretical exercise. They disappeared from the view of the front gate camera. I switched to another camera, one that covered the high stone wall that ran along the side of the property. For a moment, nothing. Then I saw a flicker of movement, a figure, scrambling over the wall. It was Jason. He dropped down into the rhododendron bushes on my side. Out of sight. They weren't coming through the front gate. They were breaching the perimeter. My mind raced. What was their plan? Jason was the scout, the agile one. Were they going to try to find an unlocked window? A back door? They didn't know the house was locked down tight. I saw Jason's figure, hunched over, dart across a patch of lawn, heading toward the back of the house. He was making for the patio doors off the living room. I watched him on the camera as he tried the handle. It was locked, of course. He pulled on it, frustrated. He turned and looked back toward the wall, giving a helpless shrug. Then Mark appeared, hauling himself over the wall with less grace. He dropped down and joined Jason at the patio doors. He too tried the handle. Then he did something that sent a fresh chill down my spine. He unzipped his jacket and pulled out a small, heavy-looking object. A tire iron. Or a crowbar. They weren't just hoping to find a way in. They were going to make one. This changed everything. This was no longer just trespassing. This was breaking and entering. With a weapon. The pretense was gone. The masks were off. I had to act. I had to stop them before they got inside. The element of surprise was my only real advantage. I moved quickly and silently through the dark house to the living room. I positioned myself to the side of the large patio doors, in the shadows, where I could see them, but they couldn't see me. I could hear them now, their voices muffled, but urgent through the glass. Just do it. Cynthia's voice hissed from outside. She must have scaled the wall too. I'm trying. Mark grunted. The damn thing is reinforced. There was a scraping sound, then a solid thud as he tried to force the crowbar into the door jamb. The door shuddered in its frame, but held. Harder, Cynthia urged. Another thud, harder this time. I heard the sound of splintering wood. They were going to get in. I took a deep breath. It was time to end this. I reached over to the wall and flipped the switch for the patio lights. Brilliant. Halogen light flooded the patio, blinding them. They froze like deer in headlights. Mark had the crowbar wedged in the door, caught in the act. Cynthia was standing right behind him, her face a grotesque mask of determination and shock. Jason was hovering behind them, looking terrified, and I stepped into the light, into their line of sight. I didn't have the gun in my hand, not yet. I kept it holstered. I stood tall, my arms crossed over my chest, looking at them through the glass. I made sure my face was a flat, impassive slate. No anger, no fear, just cold, dismissive observation. For a long second, we just stared at each other, separated by the double-paned glass. The shock on their faces was absolute. They had thought they were breaking into the house of a dying, unaware old man. Instead, they found a vigilant, waiting general. Mark recovered first. Panic flashed in his eyes, followed by a stupid, bravado-fueled rage. He yanked the crowbar free from the door and raised it, as if he was going to smash the glass. Don't, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried through the glass, amplified by the silence of the night. He hesitated. The crowbar held high. The glass is ballistic grade, I said, my tone conversational, as if I was explaining an interesting feature of the house. It'll stop a .44 Magnum. Your little crowbar is just going to make a mess and piss me off. His arms slowly lowered. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a dawning, horrifying understanding. They had walked right into my trap. Again. Cynthia found her voice. She stepped forward, pressing her hands against the glass. Dad, please, open the door. We need to talk. We made a terrible mistake. The time for talking is over. Cynthia, I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. You're trespassing. You're attempting to break into my home with a weapon. I have you on camera. All of it. The moment you broke that door, you committed a felony. Again. We're your family. She wailed, the tears starting, real this time, born of sheer desperation. You can't do this to us. You can't leave us with nothing. I'm not leaving you with nothing, I said. I'm leaving you with the consequences of your actions. Now get off my property. Or what? Mark snarled, finding a last reservoir of defiance. You'll call the cops. Go ahead. Well, tell them you're a sick, confused old man who's being manipulated by his lawyer. It's our word against his. I allowed myself a small, cold smile. I'm not going to call the police, Mark. I slowly, deliberately, unbuttoned my jacket, revealing the pistol holstered at my hip. I let my hand rest on the grip. I am a sick, confused old man, one who is terrified because he's being stalked and threatened by a group of people who have already tried to assault him and rob him. People who are now trying to break into his home with a crowbar. What do you think a sick, confused, terrified old man might do in that situation? The blood drained from their faces. They understood. The law was on my side. The castle doctrine. I wouldn't have to wait for them to break the door down. If I felt threatened, if I believed they were there to do me harm, I could end this right here, right now, and I would likely never see a day in court. The reality of their predicament finally, fully crashed down on them. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a surrender. Jason was the first to break. "I'm out," he mumbled, backing away from the door, his hands in the air. "I'm done. This is insane." He turned and ran, scrambling back over the wall into the darkness, without a backward glance. Cynthia and Mark were left alone under the harsh light. The dynamic duo of greed, utterly defeated. The crowbar hung limply in Mark's hand. "Last chance," I said, my voice soft but absolute. "Walk away, now. Go back to your cars, drive away, and never come back. Never call. Never try to contact me again. If you do, I won't be talking to you through glass. You'll be talking to a judge. And I will make sure you spend the next decade in a place where they don't care about your stock portfolios." Cynthia looked at me. I saw it all in her eyes, the hate, the fury, the desperation, the crushing loss. And finally, a bleak, empty acceptance. She had lost. She had gambled everything and lost. She turned without another word and walked toward the wall. Mark stood there for a second longer, a beaten dog, then dropped the crowbar on the patio with a clatter and followed her. I watched on the camera as they clumsily climbed back over the wall and disappeared from view. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of car engines starting and driving away, fast. The sound faded into the distance, leaving only the familiar, crushing silence. It was over. Really, truly over. I stood there for a long time, watching the empty patio through the glass. The adrenaline receded, leaving a void so vast and dark it felt like I might fall into it and never stop falling. There was no satisfaction, no victory. There was only a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. I had won. I had protected Eleanor's legacy. I had defeated them. I had been right about everything. I walked through the dark, silent house, turning off the patio lights, disengaging the locks. The fortress was no longer needed. I went upstairs to the panic room one last time and shut down the monitors. The screens went dark, reflecting my own hollow-eyed face back at me. I ended up back in the library. I didn't pour a drink. I just sat in my armchair, in the dark, and waited for the dawn. I had wanted the truth. I had gotten it, in all its ugly, brutal clarity. I had wanted to know who my family really was. Now I knew, and the knowledge was a life sentence of solitude. The cancer would kill me soon, but in a way, it already had. It had killed the father, the grandfather, the man who still believed in the faint possibility of love. All that was left was the truth, and the will, and the waiting. The first rays of the morning sun began to filter through the windows, painting streaks of pale light across the floor. They touched the steel door of the safe, making it gleam. I looked at it, my masterpiece, my monument, the thing that had held not a fortune, but the key to unlocking the rotten hearts of my own blood. It had done its job. I closed my eyes. The house was quiet. I was alone, and I knew, with a certainty that was my final, most painful acquisition, that I always would be.